hello, Massimo. Thanks so much for taking the time. Thanks a lot for taking the time to be with me today and then to answer some of my questions. So first, congratulations for getting your PhD, your doctorate. So from the Aalto University in Doctor New Media, it's super exciting. You also have a master in industrial design from Polytechnic of Milano. The title of your thesis is Open and Collaborative Design Processes, Meta Design Ontologies, and Platform with the Mecca Movement. And there's one word that you are using, which is called the open meta design. And I'd love to ask you more about it. But first, maybe I'll start with asking like very general questions. So where are you from?
I'm from Italy, and so I also studied in Milan, but then I also studied in Spain and Finland, and now I'm living and been working for several years in Spain, in Barcelona.
I see. So what do you call home? Is it Spain or do you call Finland Spain, the home?
No, well, I think several homes, like two in Italy, more than one in Italy, then other places as well. So well, it's also the experience of knowing different communities and know that they work in different ways, and you know how to can collaborate with each of them, and also how you connect it. It's not easy, you know, because they have different way of seeing the world. What we call worldviews, and then the other more complex word for this is ontology as well. And so, you know, this is the awareness that also in your life, it's maybe now increasingly easier that you get to know different communities and how then you make an interaction with them and build bridges between them.
Right.
Normally, like in real life, you know, with geographical communities, called communities, but then also in the mecca movement, which is, you know, like a network of local communities but connected globally.
Right. So I think Italy, everybody knows the word like Arduino. Are you like a child of the Arduino kind of a group, that clique, or like where you loosely connected to them and then you just happen to be Italian?
I got to know them also in person a bit later, like probably 2009. But before I was starting in 2005, I was starting to work on open source and design. Because basically, when I started working on this, already for 5 years in design in Italy, but also in Europe, started to work with the territory. You know, moving from an artifact to we design within and for a territory. So the community, the specificity of a territory. So not necessarily an artifact. There may be, but especially it's about strategies, connecting how to put communities together. Because especially one important thing in a territory, you have communities. You know, they work in a different way. And the way I approached this was back then already, it was interesting. Like maybe we can learn from open source and peer-to-peer as a way of organizing communities, you know, how to put collaboration in place with network, with more distributed networks community. So then it was a matter of time that we met.
And so one question is that I know this is a very difficult exercise, but how would you like summarize in like one sentence the argument that your thesis is trying to make, just as a very high level?
Very high level, this is a new way for designing with communities, especially the platforms for connecting communities. Not with the idea that we have one platform that works for everybody everywhere, but how do we start understanding how each community see how they work together, how the processes they put in place and they design and making these processes, so that we can connect all the distributed processes and find a way that each other can understand the different way of working. So how do we facilitate people working together with processes, knowing that they see processes and they have in a different way, that they see working in a different way? So it's also like using the technology for putting people together.
I see. And so you're interested in that process for the process itself, or you're interested in the process because you want to instrumentalize it, to do something specific with it in your personal view?
Well, the starting point, and it's still, of course, valid, was like, okay, if we get communities at the local level, we can engage them in develop more sustainable practices or changes, initiatives at local level. You know, you cannot really create a transition to a more sustainable society without having the active engagement and understanding of local communities. So the why was the idea work on collaboration and having more open and horizontal way of working, so you know that they feel welcome and they feel they're very active in this transition. What can change is that in the end, if you understand how to support and, you know, foster collaborative processes, is not necessarily it's only about designing and making artifacts. It could be in other things. Some years ago, I worked with some biologists, for example, as well. They wanted to understand how to create distributed processes, but you understand that this can be applied to many things. And back then, 2005, was already several examples of open everything, in cinema, design, in food, agriculture, healthcare. So in the end, is the idea, okay, that how people work together, they may have different processes. And the point is how to understand these processes and how they understand, not just me as a designer, but all the tools so that we can support. And then it could be, of course, in different fields. Maybe since I studied industrial design, it was very easy to start working in the mecca movement, creating digitally made artifacts.
And
but it's not only one.
And so you feel that the mecca movement, as you described, it started or was spawned out of the industrial design, or came from biology, or came, because you also mentioned the word sustainability. Do you think that that it was a kind of a hybrid child of different movements, or it was first born in one of the community and was adopted then by other movements and other necessities?
Well, if you want to see the history, like at least with the documents, records, and main events, more or less it started 2005 with Make Magazine, Arduino, RepRap, 2005, 2004, 2005. I think it was Destructible as well. It was the year, but of course these are things that were cooking for a while. Mainly, we normally say that it probably was the reaction to the .com crash. Say, okay, this is too digital. We need to put back on the ground and connect the digital with the physical. Tablets started already a few years before, but more or less those years they start together. And of course they come from very different directions. So Arduino is more from the design, Make Magazine more from tinkering DIY, but also software, Silicon Valley, Web 2.0. You have different kind, of course, of roots of this. And through the years they were connected with other kind of communities like DIY Bio, and in agriculture as well, for precision agriculture, but also in cooking. I also do that myself, start cooking. The thing is, basically, if you see the definition of maker is actually something important because it's very broad, it's very fuzzy, because of course you want to have as many people as possible, but if you go and look at the classical definitions, anybody that makes something physical is a maker. Of course, like 80% of the people are makers. And then if everybody is a maker, then nobody really is one. So the identity of a maker is something that has been studied a bit. It's something that is not static, but we increasingly have to build more. And that's also because, reinforce the way we work together, but also that could be a way, for example, for solve some conflicts and crises and clashes that we have been in the last years.
Is it because the maker is not like a professional function? Because maker is always going to be attached to something else. You're a maker of something, whereas you could be an architect, and that's like a clearly different profession, or like a fashion designer, that's a clearly different profession. Do you think maker could emerge as a profession?
Well, it could be. I mean, on one side, you need to have a clear shared identity from the inside, and then also you need to have that from outside. So I can tell you as a designer also, like probably it's clear now inside, but from outside, not everywhere. People know what a designer is. They have a very different perspective on that. So it may, I mean, one of the big things that now is happening from the maker movement is probably, experimenting a new way or new ways, several multiple ways of working together in distributed settings. And it's not like separated from everybody else. It's because I did also some research, especially in Italy, but in other countries as well. You have a lot of designers, architects, engineers. So it's not that you have, informally trained or not designers, not the engineers, not architects working. It's a mix of very different personalities. Also, that probably is also one of the more interesting things because each can contribute in a different way. And so it's more as an attitude and more as a culture. So often the idea of the maker as a movement has been criticized because of a movement that means that you will really have, a clear direction, and that we have several directions at once. Or probably it's the movement, not last the movement of decades ago. So it's still also finding itself and way of working and being. With ontology as well.
So now going into the meat of your thesis. So the word of open meta design. Could you give a definition of that framework? What does it mean to you?
So let's start first with meta design, and then we add the open, and let's see that.
Sure.
So, well, meta design, again, is probably as an approach or a design approach, design culture that has been around for some decades, but has some, again, different roots and different families, okay? And it's more rooted, if you want, on the practice, but there's also research, but it's more, starting from the practice. And again, since it started in different communities in different places. So, for example, especially in Milan and Italy, the idea of the professional designer that also is able to build the context for starting to design. So typically it's designing the design brief or understanding how the design brief was put into place. So it's probably, if you want, also closer to design management, but and education is a mix of that. And there are some other contributions that they see this in a more systemic way. So basically, more as the awareness that you're not just designing for yourself, but fostering somebody else collaboration. And then there is another one, which is actually probably, at least most research-wise, one of the strongest. This is typically what happened in new media, with the idea of designing digital environments for supporting collaborative processes, supporting creative agents. Because there was also refined a bit more, so it's a mix of different ways. So it's designing what is design, the design tools, the design processes. Then it's also designing how we work together and collaborate, and also basically then design maybe not directly the relationships, but the condition that create the relationship. So it's going from the tools, artifacts that enable us to have a more aware approach to how we design. So then all the processes, and then the social dimension arising from that, and I mainly refer to this when I work there. And so if you want, it's also a way for being more aware as a designer of what you're doing, and it's that not that you design just with the tools that you've been given from whoever it is, but you can design your own way of working. So this is also connected to what is, and this is more recent, or probably also more abstract approach, which is ontological design. Ontological design starts from thinking that basically, we design tools, and the tools, they influence how we design, So it's understanding that the way we navigate the world, not just individual, but also socially, it's both a consequence and influence of how we design, So that's why it's very important, and also because it expands how we understand how we work with other people, or we want to do more sustainable initiatives. And the open thing is basically the framework and the platform that I created in my research and practice. Well, it's open, because mainly it's for creating open source processes. It's open source itself, and it works with open source software. It's a framework that basically describes how you start from an ontology of design processes, so how to describe how collaborative work is done in design processes, and how to build digital tools, platform, but not only, based on that. So it's a framework where you understand this, but then it's also codified into a digital platform, which is it's free software, open source, it's online, and the AGPL. So basically, the work I did was develop this framework and the platform, and then test with people and understand how this can support collaboration of people together.
So the open meta design is something that I can go on GitHub and download and install to run a makerspace. That's the idea.
Yeah. It's already Dockerized, and so you can run it immediately.
Oh, wow.
But one important thing is this was done. It was also done in intermittent practice, especially lecturing and working with communities. But it was part of an approach that in design research is called research for design, which means there are mainly three ways for doing research with design. One is research on design. So you research how design is done, and this typically has been done for many decades also, especially with approaches from other disciplines. Then you have research for design. So you design for, you research, for then designing something. But research for design is a very recent approach. It's probably like, it was hypothesized at the beginning of the 90s, but only in the last 10 years was more formalized and is still in development. This is the idea that when you design something, you just do not structure this, it's not automatically research, but follow this approach, you can create research and knowledge from the practice of being a designer. So you put together the research and the practice. So what does it mean? That the platform itself is fully functional, again, it's Dockerized, but mostly was designed for being tested and creating research. Because the one important thing is it's based on a specific ontology that might work or might not work for different communities.
Right.
Which means that this is important part, putting the ontology at the center means that, of course, if you work in a different community, maybe we should design a bit better the ontology. And more concretely here is basically how you will see collaborative processes in your community. And this is basically transformed into a specific data structure. This is how ontology is seen in computer science, and also the visualization.
I see. And so, so you have case studies of how people have used this platform and how communities have used it. Has it been deployed in Spain or Italy or in Finland? And how do those different communities respond to the usage of this this open framework?
So more than deployed, it was mainly tested through workshop, and actually in all the story, because it started as basically more intangible abstract guidelines, and then it went to toolkits and platform. So the first guideline actually where I test them, for example, in Seoul, in South Korea, in Singapore, and in Finland. So of course, with a very different way of seeing it.
Yeah.
Then the toolkit in several places in Europe, and the platform I especially tested in a makerspace in the university in Milan, in the Polytechnic in Milan. So it's been more to shorter format and workshops, more than longer time span. For two reasons. One is especially because the idea was to try to understand, the research part for that, but also because so many years, communities have changed a lot.
Right.
So it's important, and this was very exploratory to build the foundation for its research. Because when you study something like the maker movement that is being evolving so much, it's not that you go on archive and say, let me look at the books of 500 years ago, and we saw, how the maker worked, and we can understand that, Right. So it's basically both understanding what's happening, navigating it, but also influencing it with tools. So basically, if you want the main contribution of this research, basically it's not just a platform and framework, but several different theoretical approaches and strategies also for then do that much faster now with communities.
I see. So in the last few years, I mean, being inside of the maker movement, but mostly in Asia, so maybe it's very different in other places. But I feel that there was really almost like a peak, and there was like so much excitement about the maker movement, and Maker Magazine also ended up not doing so well financially, and Maker Fair, and also like Tech Shop, we used to work also closed down. But I still see that it's a very robust movement, and there's still a lot of Fab Labs around, and also hackerspace. But also, so when I go to conference, which are more focused on what's happening in the background of the organizers and makerspace, that it's also very difficult to make the financial model function. And so, where do you think we are in terms of trend? Do you see that that the maker movement, as defined in your thesis, is still growing, or do you think it's transforming into something else?
This is very important because we still tend to think about endless growth for everything, right. Economy, society, right. Movement. This is more really an industrial era way right. of seeing things, and also that in terms of physical resources, natural resources, environment, this is cannot go on endlessly in a finite planet.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand, the different phase. So it has been evolving in different ways, you know. And I remember I saw some research that say, for example, in the DIY bio community, it went to at least a couple of waves. So that's a very important thing, because basically in the first wave, they were like, hey, we're going to do DIY bio in a garage. And then in real life, we're like, yeah, we don't really have the tools for doing that. It's too complex. So then it died a bit down, and then with new tools and new approaches, then improved a lot, and now it's growing much bigger. Right. I mean, I think that the maker movement for many years it started slowly, also because if you start saying, maker is anybody who makes anything, then this we've doing since we invented or we discovered or we designed the side fire.
Yeah.
So it's been quite a while. So it's not really well defined. And then, grew a lot in the last years. But this is a movement that especially has been more focus on the technology and less on the social aspect. So even if we work at, social impact and these kind of things, this has been approached but less. And when you do this, of course, then when it starts to be more techno-determinist or technocentric, then after a while, all the social aspects come back in. So that's why it's probably now I think it's a moment that has been probably maybe declining a bit in terms of the huge, the hype, which is good. You don't want to have, endless hype. I mean, the best revolution is a revolution that you don't see any longer, because then everybody's actually doing that.
Right. And you believe that's what's happening, like STEM education, going to school. Do you think that's what is the new maker movement embodied into?
I mean, this is very important because a lot of the times it was seen as, well, now we can make things but more cheaply.
Right.
You don't have to spend as much. But of course, you cannot really do everything. You can do a lot, but there is so much complexity in terms of knowledge, energy, supply chains for making things now. But one of the aspects, not only one, but one of the aspects where this has been applied a lot, and you rightly say that, is education. This has been already going on for a while. So you think now, well, okay, well, now we would like to see, maybe, I don't know, a makerspace or Fab Lab in every neighborhood. But what's going to happen in 5-10 years when students that were like, I don't know, 10 years old, 5 years ago or now, and we taught them that they can actually design their technology, they can modify it. This is also from this meta design in practice.
Right.
They can have an active role. They have an agency in shaping that. And what's going to happen? That we're going to be 20, 25. Imagine they're going to say, yeah, well, we modify things, we hack things. This is normal. It's not weird.
Right.
It started to be much more popular, that approach. So that's when really, probably want to say, okay, this is a real revolution taking place.
Interesting. So, I mean, I totally adhere with this direction, but at the same time, we can see in society. I know this is a bigger debate, but we can also see companies like Apple that are making computers that are really elegant. They have very good usability, and but also they're increasingly closed down. So do you think that there's a sort of radicalization? We talk about almost like a political, radical Islam or radical white extremism or something like this. And do you also see that the world is becoming more polarized in a way, in terms of technology, like increasingly closed and increasingly open?
Well, it's not necessarily that it's polarizing in this kind of war, but it's typically something that happens with scale, is that the more you have platforms, the big platforms, getting data, owning data and tools and so on, of course, at a certain point, they go so fast that you cannot reach them any longer. And they work their own way. With something that is open, it's not completely closed, but we know that, it's a complex way of working with monopolies. They start to be disconnected from governments and localities. This is very tricky. What I could tell you is probably it's clearly that this is much more impactful on social and political life than before. Things, all the fake news, than the trolling, but also, the impact on elections. You've been knowing about that, I usually say this is not the internet of 2009 any longer.
It's not innocent.
10 years ago, there was another internet. One thing that is probably more important, let's say, to us as makers, is something that is probably happening now that, it's not that it's dying, but it's taking a different shape, at least the free and open movement. Because there has been the focus for so many decades only on the technology itself and, how ideally this will make a free or, it's a very abstract, disembodied way of working.
Right.
So, and then you see what's recently happened, that you have a lot of criticism more on the social aspects, on gender issues, sexism, racism. So this is the physical part that has been, neglected for a while, because, hey, the important thing is that, the source code is open or free, or that you think about these very abstract topics. But then you see, of course, that even if you have contribution from everywhere, you still have, maybe racism. There are not the same opportunities, because that's true, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Or, they have some barriers, that they don't really enable everybody to be peers in a peer-to-peer way, So it's not a question of, let's erase the past, because it's impossible. But, to be clear what happened in the past and try, to address for the future.
Right.
You cannot relate that much. So it's really just how to change things for the future. And so that's why it's more important to connect this with also the whole social justice movement, environmental justice, because they're putting back in the social, the embodied part that we're missing, because that's the problem of fixing only on technology. And this is still probably a minority in the open movement, the free open movement. But if you think about the recent clashes or changes, in the open movement, free open movement, that's probably one of the directions where to go. And the things change a lot, because if you think now, we're supporting a lot of open source is Microsoft itself. Things change a lot. So it's not that aesthetic, it's not the 90s any longer as well.
Right. It's very clear that you're very passionate about specific application. You mentioned not being technocentric and using technology, but to go against a social discrepancy and sexism and racism. But at the same time, when you write a scientific paper, when you write a PhD, sometimes you have to remove that sort of passion from your writing because you have to stay some sort of objective. But because you have this in your heart and you want to convey that message, what do you hope this PhD can achieve? What do you hope people who are pursuing that goal can go into your PhD and find chapters or paragraphs as a toolbox, and they can look at those as mental tools and then use them to build the vision that you have in mind? What are the ideas that they can use?
So, for example, it's increasingly more and more important. And one thing that is happening, but not only, for example, in the colonization. So I'm learning a lot from that. But say that, of course, it's impossible to basically, again, disembody also your research from yourself. So, for example, just even today I had a call with a co-author, a very important one for a paper we're writing. We decided, let's put in a disclaimer that the paper we are writing is from our European or South European perspective, because otherwise, cannot really be understood. So increasingly, it's important, for example, to acknowledge that you don't have to write the names because it's in double-blind peer review. But but say, okay, this is actually written from this kind of perspective, so you can understand better from wherever you are talking to. And so again, this is a way of putting different worldviews together. You cannot raise. I think one of the big things emerging from the dissertation I did, the research, is that also this idea that you have one single digital frontier for everybody, because this is a new culture. This is actually a culture from typically Silicon Valley, East Coast, or maybe West Coast, maybe a bit of East Coast, that is being pushing everywhere.
Right.
But then you realize that, I would say, it's a new way of working with platforms, and they say these digital environments is not saying, okay, there is a new one single place for everybody and you accept it because this is good for you. It's actually, no, wait, what actually you think is good for you, and we interact and try to understand each other. So more than one virtual space is connecting local spaces in different places, in different cultures, but connect them globally, from the bottom up. And so in terms of the dissertation, so you have this very
big idea,
broader, big ideas. They're probably, they're already very important to start thinking a different way of designing. But there are several ways also that several contributions are important. So one, for example, is the open meta design framework itself, because helps you building platforms, taking consideration in different communities and the different worldviews that they have. Another way is basically I develop a full strategy that connects research and practice. So it makes clearly, what you can do research and practice to move forward, and bridging them in this direction. It's also did an update of what is meta design with the mecca movement. So again, there is a lot of meta design done in practice, the mecca movement, when you design and build your own 3D printers and you modify one, this you're doing meta design. But
we don't
maybe
know.
most of them, you don't talk about that.
Yeah.
And so basically, this is a bit more refined, actually, where this can be done and how it can be done. So, for example, even the Fab Labs that I designed, for me, it's a way of doing meta design, because I created the condition for other people to work. So this is going to help a lot when you create your own tools and approaches and processes. And lastly, also the last contribution is that basically I also develop a way for assessing your way of working in this. So what are the skills and disciplines that you need to know and have? And this is also moving from the idea, okay, now you're a designer, you're a facilitator, but actually, no, you're a mix of different roles, not just facilitator. And also how this is connected to your social networks and your position in the community you work with. And this is like putting also the social dimension and with all this richness as the center of where you're working.
Right.
And one thing that, at least in this dissertation is just hinted, but because it's something that I've been developing as a researcher and going to develop more time soon, I already have some publication, but we'll do more, is to connect all of this with impact assessment. There is a fair bit of work of impact assessment in social entrepreneurship, but there is almost nothing in design.
I am so interested in this. Like, this is exactly what I'm interested in, because I also can see there's a big gap. So you know that people have already started to work in that direction, or this is like unexplored, like impact assessment for the mecca movement?
I published some articles and collaborators, so we have started to grow at least the network of people working on this. It's clear that you need to connect with all the work of social impact investment, social entrepreneurship, because there is a lot of work done. But it's not only there. There is a lot of understanding the impact in research, for example, as well. The important thing is that as a maker, the problem is when you keep saying for a while we're going to bring a revolution, then at a certain point you have to show how you're doing that. And which kind of revolution, which is perfectly fine at the beginning. You say, guys, we have a new opportunity, and let's see how to make it work for everybody. Then you need to understand both at the scale of an individual project, then if you want at the mesoscale of labs or region, but also then more a global scale, what are we reaching? What is our impact? But this is also for design, because if you see in research and design, there have been few researches on the economical impact of design, with the rationale to go to the governments and say, hey, actually this has a good economic impact, so you should invest in that. And there is still a lot of work to do that, to make clear what is design, that is not just about aesthetics. We still have to work on that. But make everybody aware of what is the impact is important, because then there is not one only way to see the impact. It depends on the worldviews and what you want to achieve, but to make this explicit and make people aware is very important, because then you can see what actually you're doing, and then if necessary, adjust your initiative, you adjust your route, you navigate to reach where you want to go.
Right. So maybe I'll take one step back, because you mentioned something that's also super interesting. You mentioned about the role of facilitator and the skill. I think when you go into makerspace, I would say 99%, like, they would say, the things that you can learn are going to be like woodwork, metalwork, like lock picking, or like 3D printing, laser cutting. And when you talk about the skill of facilitating, maybe it's one of the class in the advanced makerspace, but it doesn't go much further than that. Like, if you had to run a makerspace and you had to break down the other soft skills that are necessary to actually be an active part of the maker movement beyond the technical skill, what do you think are those soft skills that are required, that should be taught actually in makerspace, that now are just like assumed that you have to have all the skills?
Well, of course, one thing is the hard skill, that you have also formal education, and the soft skill is a bit more difficult. Right. But also there you have also the personality. Well, in both you have the personality that that will make things different. And one important thing that we always tend to keep thinking about one individual person doing everything. And while it's true that, of course, you can have a rich profile and a rich personality, and you have very different aspects that you put together, you cannot be everybody. And you need to have a team also, because the day is 24 hours and you might probably want to sleep some hours. So this is important, because you always tend to have one single person running a lab, one single person doing a project. I think this is also conceptually is probably one of the consequences of not just economical, but on the philosophical level of neoliberalism way of thinking, which is basically you as an individual, you can compete with other individuals, and from this all isolated individual competing, we solve everything. This is the philosophical conceptual aspect of neoliberalism. And of course, this can work in some, but not in everything. So it's not that alone you can be a one-man band for everything. So at least what they focus on specifically in terms of being meta designer. So of course you can probably focus on other aspects. In my case, I thought, well, actually you have to be at least be a designer, facilitator, a participant as well, the searcher and a developer. Because you need also research, but creating the digital tools. And then of course there are skills for each of these. I think I divided 3 skills for each. So basically there is a diagram that you can use for assessing, your profile in this, and then you understand, okay, I'm actually lacking something here. So I will need to collaborate with somebody that can cover that, you know,
Right.
to understand how the different people, you know, can also collaborate in the different profiles.
Right. And so, was there a moment when you switched from being like a maker yourself and then switching to be more like an observer or like a meta designer and being more interested in the process of making and inventing or collaborating? Or are you still practicing both, or do you find it now more interesting for you to be more thinking about the theory and the mechanism? Like where do you position yourself? Like, are you like hands-on, or you're more like observing and facilitating now?
Well, I mean, you can count in terms of time of the day,
Right.
but that's not really like the accurate way. I think in
Right.
this, again, in terms of identity.
Right.
Well, and this, of course, can be unpacked in several ways. You know, one of the running jokes, at least here in Europe, like as a maker, you can either be the one that works on software or you work on hardware.
Right.
You know, even if you do both, or you're either good at software and bad at hardware, or vice versa. You know, and personally, I'm more looking good at software, you know, more good at the logic and the system and then other things. But this is something also I stress also when I've been lecturing, making, and so on. You cannot really separate the two. Yeah, and you cannot separate research from practice. This is also what I've been doing in dissertation. I'll make it clear. This is about really how to improve the connection between research and practice.
Right.
You know, because otherwise there is no real understanding. And then again, the percentage of my time varied through the years in different ways.
Right.
But again, it's not necessarily like in terms of how many hardware you develop or so. Like, I don't know, probably now I'm working much less than hardware, almost nothing than years ago, but I'm cooking a lot. I've been definitely cooking a lot finally because I want to do that. And again, I'm sharing recipe with people, with friends, so we are cooking in a distributed way at the same recipe, different places.
Nice.
That's making, but with the same approach. So it's more about the identity, how you work, and the skills to make it work actually, than just okay, 3D printed 3 things today, so I'm a maker. Or tomorrow, no, I'm not really that a maker.
Makes sense. So during your PhD, it's a long journey. Sometimes, you know, there are some ideas that come, some observation and influences that come, and it can be quite organic and sort of smooth. And but were there things that really were like breaks and like aha moment, and like, or is there like one major thing that you stumbled upon that you did not expect, like a really major surprise on the way to doing your research that you never thought you're going to be writing or discovering that thing?
Let's say there are so many. Let's put probably at least 3 at the moment.
Yeah.
First is when I did the workshop in Seoul, and we were using, you know, I developed guidelines for creating the processes for having open source and peer-to-peer collaboration. And the framework was based on activity theory, which emerged from psychologists and cognitive scientists, mainly in Russia and Finland, but it's used everywhere in the Western world. You know, and basically it's a systemic way for describing an activity. So if you describe a collaborative activity, you can also design it. Okay, so that was the basic thing. And very basically, you know, it starts saying, okay, there is a subject doing work on an object to reach something. It's clearly, you know, you 3D print plastics to have a device for coronavirus, you know, a protection for coronavirus.
Right.
And when we discussed that with the participants of the workshop in Seoul, it took like a lot to understand the framework. And we couldn't understand why it wasn't clear. Okay, well, it could be, you know, on specific things. Accent. But you realize, like you know, Massimo, you know, our language is structured in a bit different way. We don't really have that subject-object things that you have. So it doesn't really make that sense. You know, they might say, well, actually, this is much more deeper than go online and use this tool and translate the interface of the tool into another language. And so I say, okay, now actually you need to have to understand the worldview, the way they see the world, because it changes completely how they will work together.
Okay.
There are sure way that you can connect both, you know, with the data, digital, people in the loop, you know, human in the loop, but definitely you understand that. Another thing was when I started doing a network analysis. So, and I did a lot of them in different platforms, also in physical settings. And one I did especially, well, it's poster over there. That's a lecture I gave in Shanghai.
It's beautiful. I really want to know what software you use to have so many data points.
So then I can send the links because the paper are online and open access. And I did, again, years later, I'm doing more research. And I start to think, okay, how can we map, you know, the maker movement in terms of social structure, you know, not just where labs are. Yeah, I've been doing that. And basically one way to do that, which is used a lot in computational social sciences, to do analysis on Twitter.
Yeah.
Twitter is used a lot. It's easy to mine. And of course, well, I understood a lot of different interesting things there, but you were very important. We know as a makers that, there is a sort of difference and distinction between maker spaces and fab labs.
Yeah.
We know there were a couple of different communities. But there was no way for saying that, rather than, well, I think they're a different community. And so if you see that, you see that actually they're completely polarized. Okay, and inside they have a very different structure. So it's actually much more homogeneous in makerspace, and Fab Labs is much more diverse. And Fab Labs, they work in a different way how to connect labs, and especially they focus on courses, platforms, and so on. So, and you go there, it's not that you don't have really, or not so much regional networks, but you have networks of different people, different labs together. So it's much more diverse, socially speaking. And so that was actually a way for the first time to say, actually, we can see what's happening in the movement. I have data for saying that, and I can understand also where I'm being part of these and so on. So actually, it's a full line of research I've been working. And the third one, probably more recently, is a very nice book by Johan Restrom, which is called Making Design Theory. Is where I also learn a lot from doing these strategies for connecting design, research, and practice. And basically also explain, like, okay, if you do this, I mean, this is a proposal of doing this, and actually it's a good way if you want to understand how we design, you redefine things. If you design a new chair, you redefine the act of sitting, If you design a 3D printer, before 3D, you redesign the act of making things, And then it's with this, you can actually create some design theory, not a theory, but a design theory of something. And so I use that for understanding my own research and practice, how to put them together, create a system of that. And that's why this is one of the strategies of the future for not just me, for everybody in the dissertation. And for example, I created that with this a theory of meta design in the maker movement. So that was very good because it was a very good contribution in trying to understand, how to bring them together.
Maybe as my last question for this very high level. So there's you were talking about sustainability just before, not just now, but like a few questions back. And then in your thesis, you also make the argument that the maker movement is going to be key to develop sustainable society, decentralized, local production, and so on. My feeling is that there's an ecological crisis. And a lot of the people in the maker movement, we've seen that they're trying to do something for COVID and personal protection equipment. So, like you said, there are waves. But I like to imagine that the maker movement, as defined, like what you defined, like 2005, and the open hardware licensing could really play an important role in addressing big things like climate change. And now it's like sort of an undervalued current. Maybe it's only known in the science and the maker community, but I'm wondering if the movement could seize this opportunity to grow, and also this not only opportunity but this kind of sense of duty that is such a big. Do you think that the maker movement can significantly be part of addressing really big problem like climate change, and if so, how?
This is for maybe not all of it, but for a big part of us, this was one of the main reasons for being this. And it can be probably part of it in different ways. Of course, one of the things, again, and let's say, let's wait until we understand really how to assess the impact, because of course you cannot really think, that few people compared to 7 billion, can change completely in this. Again, other things of research is you'll also try to map how many makers there are. Because it's not super clear how many makers there is. Again, because if it's not clear who is a maker, it's not clear how many makers there are. So we need to understand what will be the impact. But again, it goes in very different direction. Probably one of the direction that was mostly focused on was, okay, now with GIS, we're going to change manufacturing. But again, manufacturing is so complex. Even for a 3D printer, you will probably need some electronic components we make in Shenzhen. So it's not that it's completely distributed. And it's normal. Like, again, you cannot go back and erase the history, the path dependency, But another way where it probably has been much more important is also, for example, again, education, for making people aware of what it takes to make things. Also could be as a starting point from connecting more people together, and then they can start connecting and do more work. Or the other thing could be, for example, more than manufacturing in terms of volume, like, okay, we're going to print in 3D all the devices or the items of the city, but what happens if we create a device or an artifact, let's call it any other way, that actually do something that it wasn't done before, and this changed a lot of dynamics in a city. You know, for example, I don't know, like it was for the protection devices during COVID, but imagine there is something that enables people to do much better urban agriculture. You know, the impact there is not on how many artifacts you created. You know, it's not on making things. The impact is on the change that you implement. And this is very important because, you know, culturally, you know, as designer, if you think what is actually that we do, it's not artifacts, but it's actually creating a change through artifacts. Okay, so that's why also we should re-aim what we are doing, because actually what we do is something very important, but it's not the ultimate things. This is probably one of the shortcomings of typical old school way of seeing design. Like, okay, we designed this, and if you add, you know, oh, let's add this in an open way or a distributed way, you're still doing the same thing,
right?
But with the old way. You know, you can make an open source car with a combustion engine.
Right.
It's still a car with a combustion engine. You know, when in research for decades has been said, let's redesign mobility and then infrastructure and cities and why you need to move. You know, so that's probably something that's, of course, has happened because that's the normal culture and way of doing things. So this also happened in the open and maker movement. And it's cool when you say, well, actually, you know, we can make a car, we can make a boat, we can make anything open. It's very important, you know, as a milestone to do that. But you have to understand, okay, they have to move, you know, to create a new world by imagining a new world. And not just by starting doing things from scratch, but also by connecting the existing work in the different communities. So that's a bit of the problem also that I've seen in the maker movement, that the always the idea that you really go, that you do everything from scratch, you go off the grid, and, you know, you alone, again, a neoliberal way, you solve everything because, you know,
you know everything.
You disconnect from society, you know? There is such thing as society, I will say, you know, not what the Thatcher said, but again, you need to understand how to connect this, because otherwise, if you do things from scratch, it's super, super difficult. So there have been a couple of projects very important. This, you know, one was the toaster project. It was a designer that started to create a toaster from scratch, even mining the metal from the mines, and it was super cool. And then of course, realized that, you know, even as a trained designer, it was impossible to do anything working. It was super expensive.
Right.
But I know there are also other people on YouTube that know that they try to recreate everything, and it's very, very important, you know, what they do, but because you understand really what it takes. A lot of people, they don't know what it takes to, I don't know, even create a paper or metal, you know, or glass.
Sorry.
But you see the complexity or you do things from scratch, you know. It's not, it shouldn't be an individual effort against evil society, but we should work together and try to understand how make sense of what's existing.
Thanks so much. And then my very, very last question, which is a little bit outside of the PhD, is now that you've done that, like, what is next? Are you gonna take those powerful ideas and implement some of them, or are you going to be, you know, working for a company? Are you going to become an academic? Like, what's next for you?
What's next in detail? Probably I can tell you in a few weeks or no. Well, let's say the important thing, again, in the way I did the dissertation, it wasn't that, okay, you know, I design or study something and it's closed and it's done.
Okay.
You know, but the way I developed it was, okay, let's develop something that actually is a future strategy. You know, so again, this was the work done this year was like, okay, I wanted to do work with specific community with their platform and doing processes, but again, for the condition and things changing, it was very difficult. Now, finally, I have all the strategies and tools and frameworks for doing that. You know, so it will probably done in a different ways, but I think it's very key that it always will be by mixing research and practice. It might be that I do practice, it might be that I don't do, I just do research, but I connect with people doing practice. But that's important that if you read this in the contribution and conclusion, there's actually, you know, like, it's actually now finally, there's a lot of fun now. Things to be done for the next decades.
So maybe it's so you're going to be using this with the specific community that you have in mind. Are you able to share some information, or do you want to be like using? You recognize that the value of your work is going to be most impactful in one particular location, let's say in Finland or in Italy or in Barcelona, or is it going to be all online and you just want to distribute a software that everybody can use?
Well, as I said before, now the future is not that it's all online. It's
Right.
always connect local communities
Physical.
through the online.
Right.
You know, so I always, well, I'm now in Barcelona. I'm always connected with Italy and other countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what probably is going to happen that probably will also reconnect a lot with other contexts that I was focusing and collaborating years ago. So biology, for example, but for example, one again is agriculture and cooking. Mm-hmm. And then say this because of course there's a lot of making that is and makers that is dedicated to creating devices for agriculture. Mm-hmm. But this is devices for agriculture, period. You're not engaged in cultivating food, distributing, making food out of that. You know, again, it's still always I only the focus on the artifact, not on the big picture, the system and the processes. You know, so for example, if you do that on cooking, it's actually something that everybody has a lab at home. It's a different lab, it's a different way, different culture. So it's something that is possible to do that as well. And again, it's not necessarily so much a question, an issue of technology, but really how you work together with existing and you connect things. Okay. But there are many other sectors, healthcare, biology, let's say, and more that there have already a lot of connections that have been working in the past years. So it will probably expand, not just doing artifacts again per se, but really how you use them with bigger systems.
So we're going to see you writing about this, or we're going to see you coming up with like sort of a product and a platform? Could
be a mix. Because I've been doing that as well so far, like from books to articles to then platform, but also I created several Python modules.
Okay.
For example, for doing some of these analysis. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a mix of a lot of this because it's part of the meta design approach. You design the things actually for changing your way of doing things.
Thank you so much for your time. That was super interesting. So with your permission, I'd love to share it online and then link to your PhD. If people want to see, they can just go on the link down in the video and then thanks a lot again.
Thank you, sir.